Howdy. Thanks for hanging in with me. This is the fourth and final video for Chapter 20, Risk Management. So let's talk about how do we calculate risk. And I've highlighted this a bit. There's very complex models. And part of my work history, I did risk management or risk assessment for high dollar assets, $1 million jet engines, things like that, high dollar, that you try to predict the reliability, availability, maintainability. And our technology was based on Monte Carlo simulation, if you know what that is, trying to calculate the probability of all the different parts and then rolling this up into a model and then trying to predict when to do preventative maintenance, when to do major overhauls, because all of this is very expensive. Well, this is the kind of complex models that you come into, statistical and mathematical models, when you do risk calculation. As I've said earlier, I'm not a big fan on this in cybersecurity because it doesn't work. I wish it did. I wish we had simpler solutions, but we don't. Solutions that worked. So I'm going through these slides again because they're part of the book and you may be interested in them, and that's great. However, I'm not going to hold you responsible for them unless you, really beg me to, okay? So there is something I want to highlight here about the FIPS 199. Someday I've got to get a slide made, FIPS 199 and FIPS 200, and on top of that is something called FISMA, and on top of that is something called the NIST controls. So two bricks, 199 and 200, they're very easy documents to read. They're less than 20 pages. FIPS 199 basically says, here's 3 levels of impact, high, moderate, and low. Just exactly what I've been saying. FIPS 200, the companion document, lays out the control families. FISMA is based on this, calling out FIPS 199 and 200, and then delegating the Department of Commerce, NIST, to come up with standards, which is why I say NIST then is layered on top of FISMA. So we talk about impacts. Again, very complex. The service life uses the service life agreement here, other requirements, scheduled deliverables, the impact. What if you're late? There's all kinds of things. If you're a day late or a dollar short kind of thing, you can have massive problems contractually. Also, then you've got impact is in our good old friend CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, as I said, I'm not going to hold you to this, but I'm going to go through the slides. They're here. If you want to discuss them, come see me. I'll be happy to discuss these with you. But they don't easily apply. For instance, we could have let's say a mean time between failures. It's very long, but if that failure is catastrophic, what does that really mean? If we have a failure in our system and the impact, it's not like a physical asset where we can say this asset's going to fail every 94 days. Okay, so on day 85 or day 80, to give us some leeway, we're going to replace this. Okay, same thing. If it's a mean time to failure, for availability, I think I skipped through one. Mean time between failures, mean time to repair, all great when you talk about physical assets. Again, qualitative and quantitative. It is impossible to conduct risk assessment that is purely quantitative. Amen. Put that in red. Okay? We tend to think qualitatively as well. And a risk assessment that measures no factors quantitatively, that measures them all qualitatively, is possible using something like your high, moderate, and low. All right? Depends on exactly what it says here. Criticality of the project, resources available, management. So we have a bunch of charts. If you take project management, you can do affinity grouping, which is basically a method of identifying items that are related, and then the kind of identifying principle that puts them together. You can do baseline identification. You can do a cause and effect analysis, Pareto charts, PERT, Gantt, interrelation diagrams, this risk management plan. There's all kinds of things that we can use to enhance this. But the one we want to talk about the most, I think, in this class, or touch on anyway, is this total cost of ownership. Let's say you go out, let's put a physical example. Let's say you go out and buy a car, and your car costs $20,000. but it's got high maintenance problems. Your total cost of ownership is the womb to tomb thing. How much is it going to cost me to buy? How much is it going to cost me to operate? How much is it going to cost me to maintain it? That's your total cost of ownership. So when you buy a car, for instance, sometimes they will show you, if it works out in their marketing like Honda, look at your maintenance cost over the life of that car and how cheap the maintenance costs are. That's what total cost of ownership means. That's it. Womb to tomb, from the day you buy it to the day you turn it in. What is it going to cost? If it's got a high capital acquisition cost, but the maintenance is low, or the operational cost, like in a car, you pay more for a car, but you get great gas mileage. So over the time, your total cost of ownership is lower. Or, there's all these kind of trade-offs, but we want to look at all these overlapping controls to minimize total cost of ownership. We don't want to get caught in looking at one aspect and ignoring the others. Another thing we do is we use best practices, and it's basically, hey, this worked the best for others, and this is what the NIST controls attempts to incorporate as best practices. And it's everything, understanding vulnerabilities, whether physical, electronic, the threat vectors, and how you're going to mitigate it, right? System vulnerabilities, we know this. Can it be exploited by a threat to cause harm? The system must have a flaw. The flaw must be known and accessible by the attacker. And the attacker must possess the ability to exploit the flaw. So think about this. Attacks occur because there's a vulnerability. But there's probably tons of vulnerabilities out there. I know there are, especially in software projects that aren't, big developmental teams. But if someone doesn't realize the flaw is there and accessible and have the ability to exploit the flaw. So there's design errors, coding errors, operational errors, maintenance errors, hardware, software, procedures, people, process, or vulnerabilities. I just want you to, again, get the idea that we are not just talking electronically, and we are looking at a roll-up. We're talking at a granular level of vulnerabilities, and then how those vulnerabilities or the impact and consequences may cascade in the system. So a threat vector is any circumstance or event with the potential to cause harm to an asset. There's a wide range of threat vectors that you need to understand if you're a cybersecurity professional: the web, wireless, unsecured hotspots, mobile devices, removable media like USB sticks, email, social engineering, and, including phishing and all this. But then you have to look at the probability or likelihood of an event. And again, you have to say, even if it's a low probability event, what are the potential consequences? So we can avoid, we can transfer, we can accept, we can mitigate. That's a 4. They talk about deterrence here. I stay with the 4. I can accept the risk, I can avoid the risk, I can transfer the risk, I can mitigate the risk. Deference says the risk is still going to be there, but I'm going to push it into the future. I'm going to deter it. To me, that comes under either a combination of mitigation and acceptance. But let's just stay with the 4. Accept, avoid, transfer, and mitigate. And these are some examples of that. And the most common example of a transferring risk is to buy insurance. Risk is mitigated typically in cybersecurity. We talk about the application of controls that reduce the impact. Accepting risk. In some risk we have to accept. And then, of course, avoiding risk. We can't just say, hey, I'm going to put my head in the sand and pretend these risks aren't there. Typically, we use some combination. We mitigate as best we can. We know we're going to accept some risk. We transfer risk if possible. We don't just avoid risk without a well thought out, okay, you know what? This is there. So I'm just going to, I said avoid, accept it. I'm just going to accept it and go with it. No, you do something, right? Only yes, we accept, let me be clear, we accept some element of risk, but we have to be careful in our acceptance, avoidance, transferring, and mitigating as a holistic solution to our problem. Clouds, all right. If you're interested in this, when this lecture is over, Google FedRAMP, FEDRAMP. it's very interesting that our government has instituted very strict cloud cybersecurity called FedRAMP. You can get on a weekly mail list. You can get all kinds of templates. I'm actually changing how I teach risk assessment management to say, assume it's always FedRAMP and take the templates you can or you don't need, because maybe it's not cloud, but they've got excellent templates. But we do have this FedRAMP that requires certain compliance to be FedRAMP compliant that is not in non-cloud systems. So for instance, you have to have a third-party authorization official say, yeah, I'm a third party. I'm going to come in and I'm going to audit your controls and say, yes, you pass, or no, you don't pass. To understand FedRAMP, take a few minutes, go to AWS, Amazon Web Services, and go down and look in their compliance or governance somehow on their website, and you will see they are FedRAMP compliant. They comply with federal requirements. They have to. If you're going to deal with the federal government and have any cloud services, you must be FedRAMP compliant. So that's one good way to say, I'm going to allow data outside my enterprise, and yet I'm going to remain in control. You know, people talk about developing their own cloud services or doing this or doing that, or, you know, buying space on some. No, go with something that's out there. You know, yeah, check your service level agreement with the vendor, but also check for FedRAMP compliance. All right, we've talked about it. We've done 4 videos. We're going to head on to chapter 21. I've given you an overview. I've told you what I think is important. If you have any questions, I expect an email. Stick with me now. We're heading on to chapter 21.